Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God, could not be a more relevant message for this 20th century prophet of peace. We remember and pay tribute to a peaceful warrior, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. America's founding fathers pledged to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor in defense of liberty and freedom. Martin Luther King Jr. was called upon to proclaim his vision for liberty and freedom in a land for all of its inhabitants, and to extend the message of love and peace with justice and reconciliation to all nations. We pay tribute to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during this challenging season of global pandemic, racial injustice, and political upheaval. Dr. King's last book is the most relevant work for today. His book was entitled, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? It was written in 1967, a year prior to his tragic assassination. As Dr. King said, social change and the methods must be suited to the circumstances of the period. Prophetically, he envisioned a post-racial society, a world where there is a community or a world house, the beloved community. The work we must do must be for the common good of all citizens. In 1968, which was the last birthday Dr. King celebrated, he showed us how to celebrate his birthday. He was working for the common good. And at that time, the scenario went something like this. January 15th, 1968, as told by those present, Jesse Jackson, the late John Lewis, Andrew Young. That morning, he had breakfast with his family. He had prayer at home with his family, Coretta, Yolanda, MLK III, Dexter, and Bernice, the family. Then he went to the basement of his church about 10 a.m. and he convened his staff and advisors and supporters that consisted of Hispanics, whites, blacks, Native Americans, Asians, Jews, Protestants, and Catholics. It was truly an integrated gathering of freedom-loving people. And on that morning, they began to organize a poor people's campaign. That's what he did on his birthday. Dr. King's unusual idealism was met by the harsh reality of realism of human suffering all across America and the world. But embodied in the determination of his idealism was the certainty that all things, no matter how hard or how socially entrenched, could change. He once said, the oppressed must never allow the conscience of the oppressor to slumber. To accept injustice or segregation passively is to say to the oppressor that his actions are morally right. King understood well that the social problems faced by oppressed people were spiritual. He understood that oppression, hate, bigotry emanated in the darkened hearts of men and women. He believed that it was sinful for anyone to assume a posture of superiority. The deeply embedded presumptions of superiority and the lack of integrity were indeed spiritual problems. He said we must remember that we are all somehow caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. Therefore, whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are all in the same boat. I hear the words of the founder of the former civil rights leader saying, we won't go back. We've fought too hard. We've prayed too long. We've worked too strenuously. We've bled too profusely. We've died too young to let a cold and callous people turn back the hands on the clock of time. King was right. As long as there is poverty in the world, I can never be rich. As long as diseases are rampant and millions of people are unhealthy and lives cut short, I cannot be whole. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. We must speak the truth to power. We must tell them to say no to crime and corruption, say no to entertainment over education. We must give the message found in sacred scriptures to shelter the homeless and feed the hungry, to clothe the naked. The time is now to sound the alarm and put out the destructive fires of racism, classism, sexism, xenophobia, acts of prejudice and discrimination. We must put out the fires of everything and everyone that would divide us. Extinguish the flames of bigotry and hatred and consumerism and materialism, and keep the dream alive. And after the smoke has cleared, then every mountain and hill shall be made low, the crooked shall be made straight, the rough places plain, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed. Your knees may get weak, your hands may get tired, your times may get tough, your valley may get dark, your cross may get heavy, but keep the dream alive. With God's help, we can stand for justice. We can work for the common good. If I can cheer somebody with a word or a song, if I can show somebody that is traveling wrong, then my living shall not be in vain. Keep the dream alive. Weeping may endure for a night, but bright early in the morning, joy will surely come. Keep the dream alive. That is my message for you today, to keep Dr. King's dream alive in these very turbulent times. A few years ago, I decided to write a book, and in that book, I dedicated the book. It was the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination. And what I wanted to do is to write about understanding, to interpret the voice, the vision, and the message of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And in this book, I have selected several chapters that I think are relevant to the time in which we are living now. One of the chapters that I have noted in the book, it's called Redemptive Suffering. And the emphasis is that even though there is suffering, and Dr. King, he himself is a victim of a great deal of suffering. But within that suffering, there was a redemptive side. In other words, no matter what he went through, he was not going through this in vain, or it was not for emptiness or something not to be valued. He was going through these things because he saw a bigger, greater picture. I heard someone recently talk about the fact that sometimes people don't value the suffering because they don't understand that life itself is not easy. It is difficult, it is challenging. And I think the redemptive suffering doesn't last always. And so I have a chapter in my book that is devoted to the fact that King endured so much suffering, but his suffering was not in vain. Another chapter in the book, it looks at the global age, and I talk about Martin Luther King Jr., the global age implications for international peace and social justice. And one of the emphases I make in the book is that most people can remember and talk about Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. But one of the things they failed to talk about is how involved Dr. King was in international issues. In fact, he was there when Ghana, the nation of Ghana in Africa, became an independent nation. He was there at the inaugural celebration of the new Ghanaian king. It was King who was also present when he talked about peace between the Middle East. He was present and was hoping, he had began to talk to the leaders in the Middle East, but he had hoped to travel to Israel just before his death to be able to preach there and to talk about the importance of coming together as one. I talk about this in my book as well. I also talk about evangelical liberalism, and I talk about the fact that sometimes the Christian church has been accused of being silent in the face of injustice. And I talk about how King, when he actually wrote a letter from the Birmingham jail, which is a very prophetic letter, he was very critical of the white Christian church because he said that they were hiding behind their stained glass windows and not committing to speak out forcefully against the injustice of racism and discrimination of his day. And so I think today we have things like Black Lives Matters, we have the Me Too movement, we have various movements that are trying hard to speak out against injustice and have not always been met with a welcoming or receptive spirit. And I think that that is something that we need to have conversation about. I have another chapter says stand up for justice, and it has to do with the moral consciousness. We must see it as a moral obligation to be able to speak about and against injustice in the world. And then the last chapter, it is entitled, Where Do We Go From Here? And I think that this chapter is perhaps the most relevant of all the chapters in the book because it speaks to us about the role that we must play in coming together as the beloved community. And that I believe that we must have a covenant relationship with one another to say that even though we may have differences, that we are all a part of God's creation, and therefore we should be valued. Every individual should be valued because we were created in God's image. So with this, I believe that the message of Dr. King is a relevant message in the 21st century and a relevant message for the times in which we live today. So let's keep the dream alive. Thank you very much.